Hello friends and welcome back to the Unfortunate Archives. Today let's go through all the books I've read in the past 3 months, which is an ambitious undertaking. I usually prefer to do this month by month, but I was traveling for a portion of June and July. I graduated, which I mentioned in every video. I also went a little crazy and, ticked off a bunch of bucket list items. So it was a great 2 months, but it also meant I wasn't reading as much as I do usually. Usually I read because I want to be somewhere else, and when I'm traveling, that's the last thing I want. So I read 5 books in June, 5 in July, and then in August I was back home, so I read 10 books and 2 graphic novels. That gives us 22 books to go through. So maybe grab yourself a cup of tea and really settle in. First book I read was 5 Broken Blades by May Corland, and this was supposed to be your very classic group of outsiders and morally great characters come together to complete a mission. So we have 6 points of views. We have 2 women, an assassin and a thief, and 4 men, a bodyguard, a prince, a spy, and some random aristocrat. And one of them gathers the other 5 to complete this high-risk, high-reward mission to assassinate an immortal god king. And of course, each of them join because of their own specific motives. But the question is, they're all lone wolves. Can they trust each other for long enough to actually complete this mission? We have 6 characters, which you realize pretty quickly is just code word for 3 couples, which is fine. And typically I just have such a soft spot for these kind of premises. There's nothing like a group of outsiders coming together to make me truly invested in a story. But in this case, unfortunately, the premise was the best part of the book. It was still very entertaining, but it just didn't do anything exceptionally. It didn't do anything that well, and it did a lot of things badly. The worst offender was the writing style, because it just treated you like an idiot. It explained the reasons behind every character's every single action. It was never, I smile. It was always, I smile because I am happy. I refuse to meet his gaze because I am angry. And it's like, dude, maybe if you just say I refuse to meet his gaze, maybe I can infer that part. So it was very, very annoying. And then the plot was fine, but there were 2 twists at the end. One of them was completely predictable and one of them was just nonsensical. And in terms of the character dynamics, which is usually the most important thing in these books, we had a grumpy sunshine type dynamic, which unless you're Jessica Day and Nick Miller, I personally don't care for. And in this case, it was kind of annoying because the grumpy one, his point of views were written kind of in this Jim Bro-y type style, which was not that interesting to read. And then the sunshine one was potentially meant to be neurodivergent coded, but outside of that, she was both kind of weirdly infantilized and also was very hypersexual. So occasionally slightly uncomfortable to read. And then our other dynamic was an enemies kind of dynamic to lovers, of course. But it was unintentionally hilarious because when we were in her point of view, she was all like, I'm definitely gonna send his severed head back to his father. And then in his point of view, he was like, oh my God, her voice is like rain on a parched summer day. So at least they amused me. And then the last couple was our only queer couple, the prince and the spy. And in a move that surprises absolutely no one who knows me, they were the only ones I was rooting for. And, other than just being queer, they also knew each other for the longest period of time. So their relationship had a lot more depth. And they were both also psychopathic murderers, which I enjoyed deeply. So their dynamic was the best part of the book, in my opinion, but it just wasn't enough to save the whole thing. It just ended up being entertaining, but very just average. So I gave it 3 stars. I think you might like it if you're just looking for kind of entertaining fantasy book with a lot of familiar tropes. And if you don't go in expecting much more than that, I went in thinking that this was going to be the new Six of Crows. And it was not even in the same league. It was just not comparable. So I was a little disappointed. The second book I read was The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. Dorian Gray is this exceptionally gorgeous man living in 1890s London, and the book begins on an idyllic afternoon when an artist friend is completing a portrait of him, while he also meets a new acquaintance who, through one conversation, manages to give him a lifelong fear of aging. However, across the years, Dorian realizes that he seems not to age. He seems to just remain unchanged and young, while the portrait of him is aging in his place. And he also notices that whenever he does a terrible, immoral act, the picture, the face in the portrait becomes more and more hideous, while he stays forever beautiful. So it's a fascinating and very famous premise, and I've been wanting to read this book for years, and it was Pride, so I figured now was the time. The reason I say that is that this book is famous for its queer subtext, and it was there. Like, it feels like a stretch to call it subtext at some points, and in fact, I'm pretty sure this book was used as evidence against Oscar Wilde in a court of law to prove his immoral ways. Even though it's fiction and all the characters are textually heterosexual. So that gives you an idea of the level of subtext that I'm talking about. I ended up absolutely loving this book. There are some parts of it that are somewhat frustrating to read as a woman because there is a lot of casual misogyny, which is partly a product of the time. But also I read it as a sign and a consequence of the character's repressed homosexuality. Like, you're not gonna think particularly highly of your wife if you were forced to marry her to remain an upstanding member of the society. But that didn't make it pleasant to read. Other than that aspect of it though, I love this book. I think the writing is outrageously gorgeous. I just wanted to underline everything. I wanted to get it tattooed on my brain if that was possible. The characters are also quite fascinating, and a lot of this book is just philosophical conversations between the characters. So there are a lot of really interesting reflections on art and morality and beauty. So if that sounds interesting to you, you should absolutely pick it up. But it's not gonna be, a fast-paced, plot-driven book by any means. I'm going to read you some of the quotes from the book so you get a taste of the writing style. I am tired of myself tonight. I should like to be somebody else. Or, you will always be fond of me. I represent to you all the sins you never had the courage to commit. Nowadays, people know the price of everything and the value of nothing. Behind every exquisite thing that existed, there was something tragic. There's also a very interesting argument in this book about how there is no such thing as moral or immoral art, or maybe it says books, I don't remember, but essentially it's just saying that only the quality matters. It doesn't matter if it's moral, it just matters if it's good, which I think as people who read books is gonna be interesting just to ponder. After that, I read this novella called When Among Crows by Veronica Roth, who wrote the Divergent series, but this couldn't be more different vibe-wise. It's only over 200 pages, so it's really hard to give you a synopsis without giving some of the story away. And in fact, I would avoid reading the official synopsis because I do feel like it's weirdly spoilery. But in the loosest terms, this is about three characters who each have their own curse, and they come together to find a really powerful witch in modern-day Chicago to help them break their curses. So this is vibe-wise a mix between a dark fairy tale and like gritty urban fantasy. It's based on Polish folklore, so there are all these Polish versions of supernatural creatures like vampires and witches and like banshees and stuff like that. Is super cool, but they all have modern day businesses, and I don't mean like Whole Food stores. I mean more like fight clubs and nightclubs and hospitals for the dying and things like that. There's just so much like beautiful, slightly creepy imagery in this book. Like there are knights of a holy order who fight with swords made of their own spines. So they have to like unsheath and then sheath it back into their spine very painfully, which is, I feel like, imagery that I'm never gonna forget. It's also really about monsters trying to make penance and the idea of being able to change yourself despite your upbringing and despite your past actions. It is about boys falling in love. It's about a very beautiful platonic friendship. So for 200 pages, it really manages to do a lot, and it really makes you care about the characters. I do kind of wish it was longer just because I enjoyed the world and the characters so much, but it was also kind of perfect as it was. Like, I didn't feel like it was really missing anything because it was short. I highly recommend it for a book that you can read in a couple of hours. It's really fantastic. I gave it 4 or 5 stars. I gave it 5 stars. Then I read Chain Gang All Stars. This is a near future dystopia set in the US, and prisoners can now enter these gladiator style death matches, which are televised as a form of reality television. And if they manage to survive for 3 years by killing other prisoners, then they can theoretically earn their freedom and leave the prison. We follow mainly 2 of the women in prison who are also in a relationship. And we also jump into the minds of lots of different people, like fans of the show, people protesting the show, people producing the show. So it's quite interesting that you get to see the same concept from a lot of different points of views. It was an interesting concept, and the author clearly had some points to make about the US prison system and institutionalized racism, and he was going to make those points in whatever way possible. So characters would have very direct conversations about these issues, but there were also real-world statistics and research studies mentioned in footnotes without being integrated much into the narrative, which can work well sometimes, but I think where this book failed was in actually making you emotionally involved in the story or making you care about the characters, because they always really felt like these vessels to just give you the information, which is kind of a missed opportunity, because the whole point of fiction is to discuss these kind of topics in a way that engages you emotionally compared to, say, a work of nonfiction or just reading a critical essay. So I feel like it just kind of missed the point there a little bit. So I can't say I enjoyed this book, but I don't think it was written to be enjoyed. I think the bigger problem was that it also didn't make me care about any of these issues more than I did already. And I think it did mean to do that. So that's where it went wrong. The only part of it that I really found thought-provoking was this question of who we think deserves our empathy, both as a society and as readers when we read about characters, because a lot of the main characters in this book are people who have murdered others or sexually assaulted people in the past. I just think the book shied away a bit from actually exploring this question in depth, which was a shame because I thought it was quite interesting. So I ended up giving it 2.5 stars. And the reason I gave it that much was because I thought just the premise was enough to incite discussion. Like, I think it would be a good book club book because it's an interesting one to talk about with other people. So in that regard, I think the book did something well. But other than that, I just wasn't a fan. Then I read Funny Story by Emily Henry. In this book, Daphne's fiancé comes back from his bachelor party and then tells her that he's actually going to run away with his gorgeous childhood best friend, who he always told Daphne not to worry about. So the wedding is off, and Daphne also has to move out of the house that they shared together. So she's understandably crushed. But then she realizes that, the childhood best friend also has to move out of her apartment, which she shared with her now ex-boyfriend. And out of a lack of better options, Daphne ends up moving with the ex. So essentially 2 childhood best friends run away together, and then the people that they abandoned end up living together and, of course, falling in love. So starting with what I liked about this book, I really liked Daphne and Miles as individual characters. Daphne was this type A librarian who was really passionate about her job, and Miles is this super chill people person who runs a bar. So they're interesting characters, and in particular, a big part of Daphne's character arc in the book is allowing herself to put down roots in this city that she really only moved to because of her now ex-fiancé. And a part of her learning to do that is her like building a community and making new friends. And I think that part of the book was really beautifully written and super impactful. However, what I didn't like, unfortunately, was Daphne and Miles as a couple. Like, I felt no chemistry between them, and to an extent, this is a personal thing because I've heard other readers talk about the fact that they had a lot of chemistry. But for me, chemistry really does come from, a level of banter and some amount of shared humor, as well as this sense that the two characters would work. That the relationship would work. And I didn't feel that at all in the book. I just didn't get what was drawing these two people together. And there was no banter, there was no humor, there was a lot of just weird moaning over food. Daphne apparently moaned very loudly every time she had a single bite of food, and this was talked about so much in the book. Like, it was weirdly emphasized, it was weirdly sexualized, and it just wasn't that funny. Like, maybe mention it one time, it's not a personality trait. So I didn't like that. And I also think I'm just too much of a cynic to really buy that a relationship you go into within a month after your, engagement falls apart is going to be anything other than rebound. Like, I just personally don't believe you're in the right space at that point in your life to find the person you're gonna be with forever. But that's also, more of a personal thing. And I do generally feel like to read romance, you do need to let go of a level of cynicism. I'm just not going to do that. That being said, there were a few quotes at the end of this book just about that idea of putting down roots and building a community that did make me weirdly emotional. I almost, teared up at some point. So that was nice, but that was kind of the only thing the book did for me. As a whole, I don't feel like I would have missed out on anything if I hadn't read it. I ended up giving it 3 stars, a very meh 3 stars, which, is a shame. Then I read Red Rising by Pierce Brown. This is the first book in a very popular sci-fi series that takes place on Mars in a very, I think, distant future. And essentially society is being divided into very clear castes. And at some point, people were also genetically engineered so that their eye and hair color matches their caste. So, for example, reds are at the very bottom of the hierarchy, and they are made up of miners and laborers. And then golds are the ruling class and are kind of seen as these near god figures. Our main character, Darrow, is a red who, through a series of events, ends up joining a rebel group, and they help him pretend to be a gold and go to the Gold's Academy so he can rise up to power within their ranks and help take them down from within. The premise of this book is hardly unusual, but the plot takes some interesting turns. There is like a Hunger Games-like tournament, except with a much larger number of participants, and the focus, instead of being on individual survival, is more on strategy and leadership. So it kind of reminded me of those games when you start out with limited resources like food or building materials, and then you have to build up like an army or a village. So it was interesting in that way, and there were some elements of Greek mythology incorporated into the world building, and I always loved that. That being said, reading this book made me want to throw my Kindle at the wall because, oh my god, every single female character was, either killed, tortured, assaulted, or chose to sacrifice themselves just to motivate a male character. Like, that wasn't necessarily the woman's reasoning, but it was the only purpose it served within the plot. And I'm so sick of stories like this. Like, seriously, we're still doing this. If I didn't know anything about the author and you asked me, I would have confidently bet everything I own in life that it was a man. There was like zero doubt about that fact. And I ended up giving this book like a begrudging 3 stars. And the main emotion I felt when I was reading it was just, on the a scale between annoyance to rage, and not in the way that the book intended. So I definitely won't be continuing with this series. I'm a little upset at how popular it is, to be honest. Since I was so disappointed by Red Rising, I really wanted to replace it with another big series. And because I had read and really liked The Will of the Many earlier this year, I decided to pick up the debut series by the same author. So I read The Shadow of What Was Lost by James Islington. This is the first book in a fantasy trilogy set in a society where a group of people have magical powers. The powers are pretty vague, but they're called the Gifted, and 20 years ago they went to war against normal people, the non-gifted, and they lost. Well, technically, normal people rebelled against them. So now, because they lost in the past, they are very tightly controlled in society, and they have to be bound by these magical tenets. One of which is that they can't hurt a non-gifted under any circumstances, like not even in self-defense. Our main character, Dorian, is a teenage boy and one of the gifted, and he's in a school specifically for the gifted. However, his powers are different from others, and in fact, they're very similar to the powers of the ruling class of the gifted, who were all killed in the war. So if anyone finds out about his real powers, then his life could be in danger. And he ends up fleeing the school with one of his friends to go and find someone who he thinks might be able to help him. However, that person ends up being another teenage boy who is accused of mass murder and has zero memories. Like, he doesn't even know who he is or whether or not he killed a bunch of people. This was very much a plot-driven book, and despite being like over 600 pages, I think, it just felt like a setup for future books in the series. I could have forgiven that, but my main problem was that I just didn't care about the characters. They felt very interchangeable beyond just their circumstances and the most like basic descriptors. You could have any of them in the place of the other and you wouldn't even know. And for me, that's the surest way to kill a book. So if you're more of a plot reader, then you might enjoy this more, because I do feel like this book was setting up a lot of really interesting concepts around morality, time, and memory, particularly, which intrigued me, but I just wasn't willing to commit to, two other large books with characters that I didn't care about, just because I thought that there was a chance it could have an interesting plot. Very disappointing, and I ended up giving it 2.5 stars. But to look at the bright side, comparing this with The Will of the Many really did make me realize how much writers can improve their craft over time, which was a hopeful message. Then I read Space Opera, which was actually recommended to me by Zelinko in the comments. So if you're watching this, thank you. In this book, humans get contacted by an alien species, and they're told that they're gonna get annihilated unless they can prove that they're actually a sentient species. And the way that they have to prove that is by taking part in this intergalactic music competition against lots of other alien species and just not come last, essentially. But through a set of events, the people who end up having to represent humanity are 2 out of what used to be a 3-member British rock band, who were briefly popular for a time, but now they haven't talked to each other for years. The bands completely fell apart, and they have a lot of personal issues to work through. So, what can go wrong? This was such a weird little book. I would describe it as like whimsical, cozy sci-fi, which you don't really come across that often. It really didn't take itself or the plot too seriously, but it still managed to include a lot of kind of touching reflections on grief and regret, as well as art and empathy. It discussed gender politics, and the characters, the human characters, were first or second generation immigrants in the UK, so it went into that experience a little bit in a way that I thought was interesting. That being said, there were also a lot of really long passages describing alien species, and these were often very funny and super imaginative, but it was a little too much for me, just mainly because I wanted to spend more time with the human characters, and the book wasn't that long. So that was my one problem with it. Otherwise, I really deeply enjoyed it. It's not going to be for everyone, but you're probably going to enjoy it if you like kind of more bizarre, irreverent, imaginative books. And you're probably also going to like it if you liked The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, because it's probably the closest book to it tonally that I've read. I ended up giving it 4 stars, and I just had a good time reading it. Thank you for the recommendation. Then I read Yumi and the Nightmare Painter by Brandon Sanderson. Though you might be more used to seeing the US cover of this one, which has all the gorgeous illustrations, which unfortunately this one doesn't have, but the cover is still beautiful. I really like it. Anyway, this is an adult fantasy novel, and we follow 2 characters. One of them, Yumi, is this priestess-like figure in a world where their technology is dependent on the spirits. So she's responsible for summoning those spirits and convincing them to go into their devices to make them work. But because of that, every aspect of her life is very tightly controlled, so she never offends the spirits. And then our second character, Painter, lives in a very different world where the level of technology and their society is more similar to ours, but there are these creatures called nightmares that feed on people as they sleep and get more and more powerful unless a painter finds them and draws them into a harmless shape, which makes them lose their power. Then one day, through mysterious circumstances, the 2 characters end up in a Freaky Friday-like situation where one of them is in the other's body and the other is kind of there as a ghost-like figure, and then they switch between worlds and have to figure out what the hell's going on. I thought this was a fun book. Both Yumi and Painter had really satisfying arcs and had to change and grow quite a lot through the story. Brandon Sanderson's world building is also always super imaginative and really cool. Like in Yumi's world, on top of the whole like spirits aspect, the ground is incredibly hot, so plants can't actually live on there, so they've kind of evolved to float around in the world, which is just such cool imagery. And similar with Painter's world, like there's just a lot of really cool details that you're gonna enjoy if you're into world building. This book is set in the Cosmere, which is Brandon Sanderson's broader magical universe. However, it's meant to be a standalone, and you can read it as a standalone. I just personally think you'd enjoy it more if you've read at least the Stormlight Archives, because it does reference the broader magic system quite a lot. That being said, you don't really need that knowledge to understand the main plot. So if you're intrigued by it, go ahead and pick it up. But if you're planning on reading Stormlight at some point, then I would recommend waiting until you've read that before reading this one. This book is also inspired by East Asia and stories like Your Name, which is one of my favorite movies of all time. However, I didn't feel like a lot of thought or research had gone into the inspiration. Instead, there was just a bunch of stereotypical elements like noodles and chopsticks just slapped onto the narrative in a way that felt a bit lazy to me. But as a whole, I enjoyed the book. I didn't think it was exceptional, but not every book needs to be. It was fun. I gave it 3.75 stars because it wasn't quite a 4-star read. But I think if the premise sounds good to you and you're just in the mood for like easy fantasy, or you're a fan of Brandon Sanderson, you can pick it up. It's just a nice addition to the universe and a cute little story. Then I read Untethered Sky, which is another fantasy novella set in this Middle Eastern inspired setting. And this takes place in a world where people can bond with these giant birds of prey who happen to be the only natural predators to manticores. And manticores are these super vicious monsters that show up and like kill a whole village of humans at once. This book begins when our main character Esther bonds with one of these giant birds, and we follow her as she decides to dedicate her entire life to her bird, and we also learn more about her background and why she's so set on hunting monsters. I really liked this story. It was nearly perfect. The things I liked about it was that it was just a beautiful narrative about people's bond with wild creatures that maybe were never meant to be domesticated. It was about fear and freedom and that desire to have enough power so you can be the kind of monster that hunts other monsters. And that particular theme just always gives me the chills. I really enjoy reading it. And I think it would have been perfect if it didn't include one of my least favorite tropes of all time. So without giving much away, there is this side character, a woman in this book, who is an amazing hunter, like Rutger, I think they're called. Ruchkar, I would say, in my own language, which is an inspiration for the setting. So I feel like, the way I say it is the correct way. But anyway, this woman is an amazing hunter, but she also wants to be a beautiful lady in court. So the way that the narrator talks about her is that she just wanted to have it all. And then the story really punishes her for that, which I feel like is a very tired trope that somehow always ends up happening to female characters, which adds just an extra level of annoyance for me. So that knocked my rating off from a 5-star to a 4-star, but I still like the book and I still think it's worth checking out, especially for something that you can read in less than 2 hours. Like, it's gonna be a good time. It is now fully nighttime, so welcome to my new aesthetic where we have no direct sunlight coming into this channel, which kind of matches the name, This is way more unfortunate. After that, I read Breasts and Eggs by Mieko Kawakami and translated by Sam Bett and David Boyd. This is an award-winning Japanese literary novel, and we follow this young woman, Natsuko, across 2 sections. In the first section, which is much shorter, she's an aspiring writer, and we follow her across a weekend where her sister and her niece are coming to visit her for the first time in Tokyo. Her sister has become really obsessed with this idea of getting breast implants, and her niece is going through puberty, so she's writing these diary entries where she's reflecting a lot on her changing body and the role of a woman. In the second section, we meet Natsuko again, but after 8 years have gone by, and now she's a relatively successful author, and she becomes really interested in this idea of artificial insemination and sperm banks and starts considering whether she might want to have a child by herself. I've been wanting to read this for a few years, but it ended up being kind of a disappointment. I liked this first section. I thought the interactions between the 3 women were quite interesting, and in general it was just shorter and punchier. But the second section kind of felt like it just dragged on and on. This is really one of those books that describes the character's daily life in a lot of minute details, and occasionally it did have some astute observations about what it means to be a woman in a way that felt quite universal, but more often the amount of details just felt a little pointless. It is possible though that something was lost in the translation, because just like as an example, the main character is from Osaka and she speaks in dialect, so quite often other characters comment on the fact that she speaks differently to them, but the translators made the decision to make her in English speak exactly like every other character, so it just felt a bit odd. And I do wonder maybe if there were other things in the prose that were a bit lost and didn't work quite as well in the translated version. That being said, there was a sexual representation in this book, which I always appreciate, but as a whole, it just was fine. It was fine. It wasn't bad. I gave it 3.5 stars. I just wish the entire thing was written more similarly to the first section. After this point, I read 3 books for my next video, which is about the best books of the 21st century. The first of these was My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante, translated from the original Italian by Anne Goldstein. I've actually been wanting to read this for a few years, so it was just a good excuse at this point. In this book, we follow the lives of 2 girls from childhood to their early 20s as they grow up in a poor neighborhood in Naples in the 1950s. So both of these girls are extremely smart, but they're living in a community and in a time period that doesn't really value intelligence in women. So occasionally it kind of creates more problems for them instead of giving them opportunities. And they end up forming this extremely intense relationship, which you can read as an obsessive friendship between 2 people who really are the only 2 that understand one another. or you can read it with more kind of undertones of sapphic yearning, depending on, you know, your preference. Regardless, at its core, this is about two brilliant women who constantly lose opportunities because they're women, and it's about their attempts to break free of the traditions and taboos that confine them, and occasionally trying to make themselves smaller so they can fit within those communities, even when it doesn't really work out that well. And all of it is taking place against the backdrop of fascism and communism in Italy, which I know very little about, but it was still interesting in the way that it showed you how these broader political affiliations impacted the smallest interactions between individual children, even, who also didn't fully understand what they were talking about. It was also a really fascinating character study. It really immersed you in the lives of these characters, so by the end of the book, the smallest actions could hold a lot of meaning. If you've read it, you might know what I'm talking about when I talk about a certain gift that had been given at the end of the book that like emotionally devastated me and the characters. So I think you'll enjoy it if you're really into in-depth character studies. I gave it 4.5 stars, and I was really taken with it as I was reading it and immediately after I finished it. Surprisingly, I haven't really thought about this book much since, but there's still a very good chance that I'll pick up the rest of the series at some point in the future. Then I read Tom Lake by Anne Pratchett. This book takes place during the pandemic, and we're on this small cherry farm where the two adult daughters of the family have to come back and help their parents run the farm because all the workers are in quarantine. So there's this cozy but claustrophobic feeling as they're trying to figure out how to spend time together as a family. And the daughters end up convincing their mom to tell them the story of the brief period in her youth where she almost became a famous actress. And in particular, the story of this one summer where she was dating a man who later did become a huge movie star, which also happened to be the summer that ended her acting career. You know how there is cozy fantasy where everything's just very low stakes and nice and mundane? This book kind of felt like cozy literary. Like, it did a good job at creating that feeling of being cooped up inside with your family and almost getting to know them again for the first time. The vibes were just quiet, nostalgic family farm, and the kind of overarching theme was this idea of really thinking about how your parents had an entire life before they had you, which is interesting enough. But there was just nothing really exceptional about this book. Like, there was nothing bad about it either. It was just good writing, good characters. I read it easily enough, but I also don't feel like I would have missed out if I hadn't read it. So I ended up giving it 3.5 stars. And, you know, I recommend it for when you're just kind of tired and in the mood for like an easy story. You know, just a nice story. Nothing crazy, nothing to write home about. It was just alright. Then I read Lie With Me by Philip Besson, translated from the original French by Molly Ringwald. This was another really short book, and it's about a writer in his 50s who is looking back at his life, and specifically the time in high school when he fell in love with, for the first time, with this other boy, Thomas. And they essentially went on to have a really intense secret affair that ended in a very abrupt and confusing way. And across all his life, Philippa has never forgotten about that. First of all, the translator in this book did an absolutely phenomenal job because the prose was so beautiful. It was insane. Like, I looked for quotes to read you, but it was just the whole book. Like, just the entire book was beautifully written. And in so few pages, it managed to create two very vivid, really interesting characters, and it also established a really intense emotional relationship between them that you really cared a lot about as the reader. And then it completely destroyed you with their story. It was really painful at times, quite melancholic, and just really beautiful. And it was one of those books that managed to create a window inside the head of this character and just allowed you to live there for a brief period of time, which alongside beautiful writing is my favorite thing about literature. So it was no surprise that I was obsessed with this book. I gave it a no questions asked 5 stars, added it to my favorite shelf, and I highly recommend it if you're interested in beautifully written, character-driven stories. I also think it's interesting that the main character's name is Philippe, which is the same as the author's name. So I feel like it might, I don't know if there are autobiographical aspects to it, but I feel like if you're interested in that autofiction place in literature, I think you might also really enjoy it. But at this point, because I was reading a bunch of slower paced, heavier literary novels, I wanted to break it up a bit, and I picked up the Foxhole Court, which is a self-published series with kind of a cult following. But how do I describe it to you? So essentially, we start by meeting Neil, who is this high school boy that doesn't have a family, seems to be scared for his life, and is on the run, and has had like multiple fake identities. In the beginning of the book, he's in this high school team for a made-up sport called XC, which is really popular. And his high school coach actually ends up getting him recruited to a university team that plays in the big leagues. And initially Neil thinks joining the team is the worst idea for him because, you know, he's trying to remain anonymous and all the games are televised. But he ends up deciding to join anyway, only to realize that he is not the only member of the team with dangerous criminals after him. So, you know, this is... the best way to describe it is that this is homoerotic mafia / sport fiction, and that wasn't really something that I was looking for, but to be honest, it sounded really good. Like, it sounded like the kind of book that you would read in like an intense reading spree from like 12 a.m. to 6 a.m. and then try to leave behind you, but would always carry with you in a part of your soul. So that was my expectation going in, but unfortunately, at least for me, that definitely wasn't the case. It didn't end up being quite the guilty pleasure that I wanted, and you know, I mainly just felt guilty and a little bit confused after reading this book. Some of the scenarios are just so bizarre that I just couldn't get past it. Like, for example, they have this one member on the sports team who is very violent and unhinged, but for some reason they all like fully believe that this one psychopathic teenager can protect them against the American version of the Yakuza, essentially, like American mafia, which, you know, I just couldn't accept that. And then he's also court ordained to take like medication, so he's less violent. But the way that the medication and its side effects are described are just completely nonsensical. Like, drugs don't work that way. There are other things that are questionable about the book. Like, there's this one scene where characters take another character and like trick him into taking drugs, and then one of them also forcibly kiss him, which is still assault, you know, even though everyone's a dude. I hope that's perfectly clear. But then the book just kind of brushes past the scenario. Like, even the adult characters who find out about it are just kind of like, that's like what he does. We're sorry, but that's just what this person does. So, not, let's just say problematic. That being said, I've been known to enjoy some problematic self-published stories in the past, and I do love the idea of an unhinged found family, but there just wasn't enough good stuff in the book to offset the problems, and the writing style was just incredibly juvenile and also had just practical problems. Like, I just got the sense that the author kept losing track of which characters were in a scene. So, for example, if there were 4 people there, you'd go pages with dialogue just between the three of the characters, and then one of them would suddenly say a line, and I would get a jump scare because I'd completely forgotten that like 4th person was also in the scene. And there were a lot of other like small problems like that just, you know, really add up over time. So it wasn't really for me. Like, I can imagine being the type of reader who really enjoys this book, and if you enjoy it, I'm really happy for you, but It wasn't my particular brand of guilty pleasure. I ended up giving it 2 stars, and I won't continue with the series. Then I read this graphic novel, Yvain, by M.T. Anderson and illustrated by Andrea Offerman. So this is based on a story of one of the Knights of the Round Table, Yvain, the Knight of the Lion. And it's essentially about how he falls in love with the widow of a man that he murdered, and then the adventures and ensuing drama. The main thing I can tell you about this is that medieval romances are just very weird. Quite often the hero or main characters are just these pig-headed toddlers put in adult bodies and given sharp swords, and that doesn't end well. Like, they just make so many decisions that if you look at through a modern reading lens are just completely nonsensical. So you can't really judge it by the same standards as you would like a 21st century novel. That being said, I think this one is interesting in particular because there is a strong sense of irony in the story, even though, you know, Yvain views this story as a romance. You kind of get the sense that the woman, the romantic interest, views it as more of a tragedy, which is quite interesting. I just wish this adaptation, like the graphic novel adaptation, went into that a little bit more, like maybe added a few more pages to really drive that point home, because I still feel like it's nice that it was subtle, but it could have been a bit more emphasized and still would have been subtle enough. Let me show you the art style, since it's a graphic novel. Like, I'm showing you the page with the angry woman, which tends to be my favorite. I like the art style. It wasn't like, it's not my favorite, but I liked it, and as a whole I gave the book 3.5 stars. Then I read Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel, which was the second book I read for the next video. This is about a dystopian future where a flu pandemic just happened really quickly and killed off the majority of the population within a few weeks. So like 90% of the population is gone, and civilization as we know it has come to an end. So the book moves between the points of views of several different characters who are all in different time points through this process. So you get to see the time right before the pandemic, you get to see a few years or a few months into the pandemic, and you also get to see a few decades after this pandemic. And it's really interesting because there are some characters who, you know, live the majority of their lives in our world essentially and completely remember it, but then there are also children who were born after the flu and they don't remember anything about our world. Like, to them, phones and laptops and stuff are just historical artifacts. There is also kind of a plot. There is also a plot which kind of follows this Shakespeare trope, who move between different human settlements in the dystopian future and put on plays, but they end up becoming entangled with a really creepy, violent cult. But this isn't the kind of book you read for the plot. This is also completely different from any dystopia I've ever read. It feels more like a love letter to all the modern conveniences that we take for granted. You know, things like being able to get on a plane and just fly, or press a button and call someone all the way across the world, or even just like electricity. Honestly, this book was written in a way that made you look around you and just see miracles everywhere. It was filled with so much awe and wonder at the resilience of humanity, as well as the ingenuity of everything that we have today. It felt like such an admiring look at humanity, which isn't usually what you get in dystopias. It's kind of the opposite of what you usually get in dystopias. But I just absolutely loved it. It was a really nice reading experience, super hopeful, wistful, but there was also an undercurrent of fear at the thought that we can actually lose it all. And especially, you know, thinking about COVID, it was a bit chilling to think, oh, you know, what if it had gone this way? So that combination of wonder, hope, and an undercurrent of fear turns out to be one of my favorite combinations. I just absolutely love this book. I've thought about it quite a lot since I finished it as well. It was a clear 5-star read for me. I fully understand why it would be one of the best books of the 21st century. Then, to keep a balanced reading diet, I read a Harry Potter fanfiction called Wait and Hope by Might Be Writing, which, as far as fanfics go, was incredibly decent size, being only over 200 pages. That's incredible. Essentially, this story starts when Hermione wakes up in a hospital and she is told that she was in a magical accident, and they realize very quickly that she's lost the memories of the past 6 years of her life. So in her mind, the war has just ended and she's still dating Ron, but in reality, she is now in her late 20s and married to none other than Draco Malfoy. This was a really cute story, all about falling in love with the same person for the first time again. But it was also about coming to terms with a version of yourself that you don't recognize. So there were a lot of really interesting scenarios. For example, like Hermione goes to her closet and she realizes that her style's completely changed in the past 6 years. So she's really uncomfortable with her own clothes, or she's made new friends who are now strangers to her. And of course, everyone keeps telling her that she's this perfect couple with her husband, who she barely recognizes. Like, she has no memories of their entire relationship. So it's really interesting as a premise. That being said, despite how interesting the concept was, I just realized that I'm more interested in seeing characters getting to know each other actually for the first time, because despite the fact that the amnesia was complicating things, I just felt like the fact that they were already married reduced the tension for me significantly. But that's more a matter of personal taste. I still think, kudos to the writer, because despite the fact that I realized I'm not a fan of this trope, she still managed to write a story that even I enjoyed quite a lot. So, if you're shopping around for a new Hermione fanfiction, I think this is worth giving a go. At this point, I was quite stressed over things in my personal life, and the fanfiction hadn't quite cut it in terms of calming me down. So I went back to my actual comfort read turned guilty pleasure, which is, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. This is actually quite sad, because it could have been just a pleasure without the guilt if J.K. Rowling hadn't decided to make transphobia her entire personality. But, we can never really go back. It would be funny if I decided to give you a full, synopsis and review of Harry Potter. But, yeah, it had been a few years since I read it the last time. So I think I was a bit curious to see if it suddenly felt juvenile or flawed to me. But to be honest, I'm sure the series has flaws, but there is just such a strong nostalgia element associated with the story for me that I was still as blind to any flaws as I was when I read it at 11 years old. And I also have the Mina Lima edition, which, to be honest, is just the most beautiful thing I own. So let me show you Diagon Alley. Look at this. Then I read Demon Copperhead, which was the last book I read for my next video, which I don't think I've mentioned. In this book we follow Damon, who is nicknamed Demon because of his red hair, and he lives in this poor rural town in the US. And he essentially narrates you his life from his childhood with a single mother to ending up in foster care to then being forced to work by his foster families despite being a literal child, a brief period of happiness in high school as an athlete, and then falling in love, struggling with addiction, and essentially the book ends somewhere in his, I think, late 20s. And none of that was a spoiler, by the way. It's all in the synopsis. So this is meant to be a modern take on Charles Dickens' David Copperfield, but you really don't need to have read Dickens to read this. They just cover a lot of similar themes. And it was an interesting book. I think the best part about it was Demon's narration, because there's so much personality and wit that comes from it. It just makes you feel like he's staring you in the face. and telling you to listen to his story in a less crazy way. But it's just a really effective way of grabbing your attention and making you care about his character. And the humor is very much needed because it's a very dark and heavy book. Like, it sometimes kind of feels like you're just going from one sorrow to the next. The first half of the book, though, I was absolutely captivated, and that was partly because of the narration. But the second half lost that a little bit, and I just found my mind wandering, and I felt like the story dragged a little bit. It might have also been because that's the part where the majority of the addiction storyline takes place, and addiction does flatten out people's lives. But I don't think it was a deliberate choice, to be honest. I just feel like the storytelling wasn't that strong in that half. One of the main themes in this book was also the unfairness of stereotypes about people living in rural areas, particularly in the US, and it brought up some interesting points that I'd never heard before. Like, it talked about this idea that the US government had deliberately created these stereotypes to create a divide between people living in rural and urban areas, specifically because people living in rural areas rely on a land economy, and so they don't have to pay as much tax, and people living in urban areas have a money economy and they have to pay a lot of tax on that. So, you know, these stereotypes they created to push people towards living in urban areas, which I thought was quite interesting. And I have no idea if there's research behind that or if it's completely made up or if it's like a fully known phenomena. But as a concept, I just found it quite fascinating. But all that being said, I did wonder if with some of the storylines and specific plot points, that this book wasn't just recreating the same stereotypes that it was criticizing. And I haven't quite made up my mind about that. I don't know. It was interesting. I ended up giving it 4 stars. That being said, it did leave me feeling very emotionally drained, so just be aware of that before going in. Then I read The Sword of Kaigen by M.L. Wang, which is a standalone fantasy book I genuinely only heard about from TikTok. And let me tell you, even if I never again get a good recommendation from BookTok, I'm still going to be forever grateful simply because it brought me to this book. I'm so excited to talk about it. So essentially, this book takes place in a society where magic and technology exist side by side, but our main characters live in a coastal village where they still really value the traditional ways of life. So they have much less access to technology than the rest of the world, but they have really powerful magic and really value fighting skills. So we follow 2 characters, this mother and son. The son is this 14-year-old who, despite being quite young still, is a very powerful warrior. However, he's just beginning to question if the information they've been receiving from the empire their whole life can be trusted or if it's more propaganda. And then the mother, Misaki, on the surface is this really demure housewife who very happily serves her children and her cold, distant husband. But beneath the surface, she still remembers the days when she was sent to this international school and learned to fight alongside her classmates and was an incredibly badass warrior. I love this book with every fiber of my being, so I am going to talk about it for a good while. I'm just super excited. So this was originally a self-published novel that got really popular, so it was picked up by a traditional publisher. And you can tell because the structure in this book is so unique and so completely different from traditionally published fantasies. Essentially, in fantasy stories, you typically have a big external conflict, right? You have like a main villain or some huge encroaching war. And then you also have the character's internal journey. And what usually happens is that the character has to go through an internal change where they, face their self-doubts and come into their powers before they can be an effective warrior against the external threat. So, for example, this is the moment right before the big war where the character suddenly has an awakening or some sort of descent into power. And the climax of the story is going to be the fight against the external threat. That's like your typical fantasy structure. This book, however, does something radically different and instead decides to completely prioritize the character journey. So, you know, instead of the character having to change to face an external threat happens so the character can change. And it might sound like a small difference, but it changes the entire structure of the book, because instead of having the large flashy battle scenes at the very end as the climax of the story, we have them happen in the middle of the book, and they are very cool. Don't get me wrong, the fight scenes in this book are top tier, but a good portion of the book afterwards is actually spent as we see how the characters now have to grieve and recover and change as a result of all the trauma and destruction that happened because of, you know, all the battles. So it's so fascinating and it was so beautifully written. And then the climax of the story ends up being a very small, intimate duel instead of the big flashy battles, because that's the most significant moment to the character's journey. It's the most meaningful. It was just was so good. This story was just so refreshing and profound. I don't think you like this if you're looking for a traditional fantasy. Like, it does have a lot of the really cool elements about fantasy, like interesting world building, good characters, good fights, but really this is, I feel like, more appealing to people who like that borderline between literary and fantasy, because it's essentially a literary character journey about a woman who is looking back at her life and regretting the decisions that led her to her current marriage. But this journey is happening inside a really cool fantasy world with lots of powers and battles. It felt like a book that was written specifically for me and readers like me. So if that appeals to you, absolutely pick it up. I do need to warn you though, there was a good portion of this book where I was just continuously crying. Be mindful of that when you're going in. It was an absolute favorite book of all time for me, like a 6 out of 5 stars. I'm just really glad I got to talk about it. The last book I read in August was The Complete Persepolis by Marjan Satrapi, which I believe is a collection of 4 individual volumes of her graphic novels, collected all in one convenient package. So this book follows Marjana's memories from the time she was a child in Iran, right before and during the Islamic Revolution, and then during the 8-year war between Iran and Iraq, then her high school education as she briefly moves to Vienna, and her eventual return to Iran where she goes to university. Starting with the good, I thought the story, particularly in the first half of the book, was absolutely beautiful. There are a lot of moments of heartbreak and humor, kind of in equal measure, and there are a lot of idiosyncratic details that you really only get from a real person's memories. I also thought the book was particularly strong in capturing the ways that children think about the world and about themselves, and that was part of the reason why the first half of the book was stronger, because it was set in Marjana's childhood. And then finally, the book also really captured this image of a super supportive, warm family, which was really lovely to read. There are 2 things in particular I want to mention about the book. The first one is not really a flaw, it's just that this is an incredibly biased account, which is fine because it's a book of memories, you know, it's not claiming to be a historical account. But there are specific events that this book kind of describes as historical fact, when in reality to this day we don't know the truth of them, like they still remain ambiguous. So if you are a foreign reader of this book, I would just strongly advise you against taking the story in this book as fact, as a historical account of what happened in Iran. In addition to general bias, this book is also about members of a family who did belong to the very wealthy class. And in the first half of the book, there's some awareness of that fact. You know, like Marjan is thinking about the fact that they have a live-in maid and she's conscious of the social class difference, or she's self-conscious about getting into her dad's fancy car and moments like that. But that awareness kind of disappears in the second half of the book, which brings me to my second point and kind of my main point of criticism for this book, which was this sense of internalized misogyny, or at the very least like a complete lack of compassion for other women in the second half of the book, because Marjana has a super supportive family who give her all her freedom and really prioritize her education, but then she's very, very quick to look at other women who definitely didn't have those same privileges at the time, and then judging them as being traditionalist or backward or shallow. And this happens quite a lot in the second half of the book. Like, she doesn't really show any self-awareness about the fact that a lot of these progressive views that she has are just a product of her opportunities and environment, and instead she seems to kind of view them as something that's internal when it really isn't. Like, one instance that comes to mind is her being like, oh, I wish I could tell my classmates that marrying for money was no different from prostitution, which, first of all, yes, she's looking down on sex work, but she's also completely discounting the fact that for a lot of these women, marrying for money was the only way to have the sort of freedom, or at least the opportunities that she was very freely given, you know? So there is a lot of small moments like that that added up and generally just made me feel like the second half of the book lacked the kind of self-awareness that made the first half so enjoyable. It is also possible that I'm being more harsh on this book because it is so close to home, but I think that's just the nature of these things, you know. You're always gonna, I think, be a bit kinder on foreign text, if only because you just don't have the frame to fully criticize them. I did still really like the book. I would have given the first half of it 4.5 stars, and then the second half like 3 stars. I still think it's worth reading. I recommend it, and I think if you don't know anything about Iran, this is going to be super fascinating. And if you are from Iran, you're gonna be very sad, but you know what's new. There you have it, friends. An entire day has gone by and I've learned not to try to cover these many books with this amount of detail ever again in a single video. It was slightly insane. If you're still here, I'm genuinely so grateful. I have a feeling you might be one of my real life friends, and if you're not, you should be. Genuinely. Thank you for being here. And as always, please take care of yourselves, and I'll see you real soon. An actor, so act like a stand-up guy. Whatever devil's inside you.